thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I would like to add my thanks to Tyler and to New America. And I would like to thank you, Cheryl, for your leadership and help over these many years on so many projects I've been involved in. And Reva, it's great to have you here and have your leadership in the program this evening. So let's plunge in. One of the things that has been said by the most important financial personalities of the day is that financial crises cannot be predicted. That the crises of 07, 08 could not be predicted. And if we have one in the future, it cannot be predicted. We've had some folks refer to these events as black swan type events, once a generation type events. We believe that financial crises can readily be predicted. And furthermore, since we have the information to predict them, we can prevent them. And we can do that by focusing on private debt rather than a focus on public debt. And I start by giving you a sense of how big a factor private debt is in the economy versus government debt and other things. If you look at this chart, what it is the growth in these categories between 1997 and 2007, which was the decade leading to the crisis itself. And as you can see, private debt grew $14.4 trillion in that 10-year period. That absolutely dwarfs the growth in government debt, which grew about $3.5 trillion. It dwarfs the $3 trillion growth in the money supply, which economists kind of endlessly point to. Frankly, it dwarfs the $5.5 trillion growth in GDP itself. Private debt is the biggest factor in the economy. And look over here at some of these other things. Federal taxes increased annually or over this 10-year period by $1.5 trillion or so. Exports are about $1.5 trillion, so the increase over the 10-year period is about $0.5 trillion. So in this 10-year period, if we had raised taxes or lowered taxes by 10%, that would have impacted the economy by about $2 trillion. Lending created $14.4 trillion in this period. It's the 800-pound gorilla, if you will. Now, I hope I can get, there you go. Private debt was the cause of the 07-08 crisis. Now, the biggest part of this was mortgage debt itself. Here we show mortgage debt as a percent of GDP to normalize it through time. And from 1970 to 2000, mortgage debt grew about 17% per annum, per decade. In the 6 years between 2001 and 2007, it grew an astronomical 46%. That's what precipitated the crisis. And it wasn't just mortgage debt, it was all forms of private debt. If you look here at the growth levels between 01 and 07, private debt in aggregate, and by private debt I mean consumer debt plus business debt, those two together grew 20% to GDP. And frankly, as you can see, even though these levels have delevered a little bit, by historical standards, private debt is still near an all-time high in the United States, both on the consumer side and the business side. We asked the question, if private debt caused the 07-08 crisis, was it a factor in other major crises in our lifetime? We looked at the Depression, and sure enough, you see this telltale pattern of a rapid increase in private debt in the 5 years leading up to the 1929 stock market crashes. One historian reports that in 1927 alone, there were 1,000 or more skyscrapers under construction across the United States. There was a skyscraper being built in Beaumont, Texas that was larger than any skyscraper on the continent of Europe. We looked at the Japan crisis right here, which happened where this black dot is in 1991. It was one of the major crises of the post-World War II period. And again, we see this very telltale pattern of very rapid growth in the 5-year period leading up to the crisis. In this case, 28%. Now you'll notice something else in all of these crises. Government debt in the period prior to the crisis, which is right here, is low and very benign. It's not increasing. In Japan, you have the same thing. In the 5 to 8 years before the crisis, government debt is low and stable. Government debt is not a factor in the period leading up to these crises. Then we go look at the Asian crisis of '97, really the other major crisis in the post-World War II period. And the two biggest crises within what is referred to as the Asian crisis were Korea, South Korea, and Indonesia. Here we see the telltale pattern again. Rapid ascent of private debt in the 5 years prior to the crisis, 29% in Korea, 43% in Indonesia, and in both cases, government debt is low and benign in that period. Here's an even more extreme case, Spain, which of the major Eurozone economies has had and continues to have the most egregious situation. In the 5 years leading up to their '08 crisis, private debt to GDP grew by an astonishing 49%. Public debt actually improved in that period. When you're having a lending boom, everybody feels like they're getting rich. They're paying more taxes. The government revenues are flowing in. The government feels like it's a miracle. That's the hallmark of the period leading up to our crisis. Now, we went beyond these 4 crises and we looked comprehensively at every crisis in major economies in the world. And we picked a cutoff of $500 billion or more. And there's 22 countries that have $500 billion or more of GDP. And they collectively constitute 85% of world GDP. So if you look at those 22 countries, frankly, you're really looking at the world. Small countries can have crises for a lot of reasons. They can be next door to a country that's having a crisis, and that alone can cause them to have a crisis. But for major economies, these 22, anytime you have private debt to GDP growth of 18% or more in 5 years, and an overall level of private debt of 150% or more, you get a crisis. It happens almost without exception.
You're going to tell us why?
I will. That's an excellent question. Let me say one more thing before I get to that. It's not just mortgage debt. In the U.S., it was mortgage debt centric. So a lot of commentators are saying, this is a mortgage debt phenomenon, and if we can prevent runaway mortgages in the future, we can prevent crisis. But other crises have been more business debt than consumer debt. In Japan in '91, it was more commercial real estate and industrial lending. That was also true in Korea in '97. So the key is tracking aggregate private debt, both consumer and business together, not just consumer. So why does runaway private lending, and when it grows this 18% in 5 years, I use the term runaway lending to describe it. Why does it cause a crisis? 2 reasons. First of all, you've built too much of something. You've built way more of something than you need. In the case of the '07 crisis, it was way too many houses had been built, far in excess of the actual demand of consumers. In Japan in '91 and Korea in '97, it was way too many commercial office buildings. It was way too many industrial plants. If you go back, we'll look at in the book, we actually look at this phenomenon in the 1800s.